to see that?
Yep.
Looks good.
So do you see the full screen right now?
Maybe we'll just
So
see
I
the
see
next slide.
I see your presentation screen. So you may want to flip your monitors.
Oh, okay. It's so weird because I just did that, but always, well, let me try it again.
Perfect. Yep,
Okay.
I see your full screen now. Yep.
All right, we'll go ahead and get started. All right. Bonjour, Anine, and welcome to the 5th installment of our 2020 GLIER TRUS virtual seminar series. My name is Katrina. I'm from Dr. Donna Kashian's lab at Wayne State.
And my name is Corey Bertrand, working out of the Heath Lab at the University of Windsor. And we are your hosts for today's seminar. To begin, we'd like to acknowledge that the University of Windsor and Wayne State University sits on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, the Anishinaabe Nation, Peoria, Miamia, and Mississauga Nations.
We, as the Windsor and Wayne University communities, would like to move beyond acknowledgements, and we would like to not only give our respect to the traditional territory we are on, but also to commit to learning and growing and starting with our partnerships and collaborations moving forward.
Also, to that end, we are excited to announce that we will open the seminar series next semester with a traditional ecological knowledge panel. This will feature knowledge keepers and elders present here in the Great Lakes Basin. So save the date, that is Friday, January 29th at 10 a.m.
We're also pleased to announce the final 2 speakers for this fall season. On Friday, December 4th, we have Dr. Supriyo Kumar Das, an Antarctic freshwater scientist from Presidency University in India, who will present alkanes for UV screening, Ask Antarctic Algae and Mosses. And then the last one will be Friday, December 18th by Dr. Paul Baumann, the Canadian Society of Exploration and Geophysics Distinguished Lecturer, who will present Good Geoscience in Dire Places, Searching for Water in Humanitarian Crisis.
Before we begin here, we have some Zoom ground rules. Everyone should already be on mute and have their videos off. Please confirm, and if not, please mute and turn your video off now. Your chat facilitators today are Matthew D, Gallery, and Zoha. Please send your questions to them or post them in the main chat, and then they will pass them on to myself or Katrina, and then we will ask Erin the questions. This talk will be recorded and posted online at a later date, and we would like to ask our technical team to initiate. I think it's recording right now, but if it's not, please start recording. And so for the format of our seminar today, it's going to be the speaker will deliver a short seminar presentation, 30 to 40 minutes or so. And then we're going to have a quick question period. And then early career researchers are encouraged to stay for the second half, which is focused on more career mentorship and Q&A style discussion with Erin.
All right, thank you, Corey. Now I'd like to introduce our invited speaker. Dr. Erin Dunlop is a research scientist with the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry and is based out of Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario, Canada. Erin leads a research program that focuses on fish population dynamics in the Great Lakes, with a focus on providing applied science to inform management and policy decisions. We'll now hand it off to Dr. Dunlop. But a quick reminder, if you have questions, please send those to the chat facilitators during the meeting. So I'll hand it over to you, Erin.
All right, wonderful, thanks. So first of all, just a sincere thanks to the organizers of this seminar series and the graduate students also that invited me here to give a presentation today. I was just saying to her picture a few moments ago as people were rolling in that I always enjoy the opportunity to speak to university audiences just for the chance to talk about some of my evolutionary work, which I'm pretty passionate about. So I'm excited to be here. And I also just everyone out there in cyberspace for joining this morning as well. So the funding for some of the work that I'm going to talk about today has come primarily through the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, as well as the Canada-Ontario Agreement on the Great Lakes Water Quality and Ecosystem Health. Okay. There's a growing appreciation that evolution can occur on rapid enough timescales to affect ecological processes and vice versa. So these reciprocal feedbacks are always occurring, are sort of what we refer to as eco-evolutionary dynamics. Now, you might say, well, isn't it pretty obvious that these two processes, these two things should be linked? And I would say that, yes, I think so, but traditionally the fields of evolution and ecology have been sort of, the disciplines have been somewhat separate. A case in point in this is when I was doing my PhD at the University of Toronto. I was in, at the time, the Department of Zoology there, and we had a separate lunchtime seminar series for ecology and for evolution. And Trevor probably remembers this well because he was there. He was there at the same time too. So we had an eco lunch series and an evo lunch series. So just to sort of speak to the separate nature that these fields have sort of existed in traditionally. So to explain further this concept of eco-evolutionary dynamics, I have this sort of simple example up here where we have a lizard living happily, and there's then an invasive lizard or a new lizard species introduced that begins to predate on this population. So these smaller lizards, you know, have adapted to the environment that they live in. And you know, everything's going fine. We then have this new lizard species that's introduced, and that lizard species begins predating upon this smaller lizard species. So initially, you might see an ecological response in this population. So basically, the numbers of the smaller lizard species might decline, and this might have cascading effects you know, throughout the food web. But this is just a purely ecological response. There's been no evolution yet. Now, over time, we might see that there might now be an evolutionary response in the small lizard population. So these small lizards may start to adapt by evolving shorter limbs that allow them to sort of move higher in the tree and escape predation by this lizard. So we then see an evolutionary response in this small lizard population. And then this in turn can have further ecological repercussions. So as you might imagine, now we might have further changes in that larger predatory lizard species, and then changes in the prey of this smaller lizard. So lots of things going on, but basically the idea here is that ecology and evolution are intertwined. All right, so in animal populations, and including the fish populations that I'm going to talk about today, there are many sources of selection that could cause various evolutionary and ecological changes. And one of the more potent sources is anthropogenic selection. And anthropogenic sources of selection, as many are appreciating now, often cause greater rates of change than natural sources of selection. So an example of this is shown on the right-hand side, where some researchers looked at the potential for urbanization to cause evolutionary changes in animal populations and other populations living in these urban communities. Some other sources of anthropogenic selection, you know, maybe they're pretty obvious, but they might include agriculture, domestication, harvesting, pesticide use, and climate change. So these are all sources of selection that could induce changes in our populations. So for today's talk, I'm going to be speaking about two specific examples, harvesting and pesticide use. Okay, so taking our lizard example and now moving into a lake environment, such as the Great Lakes, I'm now going to spend a few moments and talk about how harvesting may impact these eco-evolutionary dynamics and lead to evolutionary changes in our harvested population. So on the left-hand side here, we have our initial population. They are, there's various sizes of fish present, and they have adapted to the environment that they find themselves in. And in such an environment where we don't have any fishing going on, we often see that large body size may be favored, simply because larger fish are more capable of evading the predators, the natural predators that might be out there. Now, when we introduce fishing, things can change quite a bit. So fishing is oftentimes selective, either intentionally or unintentionally. And it often selectively removes fish with certain characteristics. An example as fish with larger body size are more likely to be fished and removed from your population. So, as I said, this can be intentional or not intentional. So, there might be a higher economic value placed on larger fish. So fishermen might seek these for more economic return. There could be mesh sizes of the gear that is being used that sort of targets fish with a certain size. And there might be minimum size limits imposed through management measures that protects fish with smaller size and instead focuses the harvest on fish with larger size. So what this means is we're always sort of removing these larger fish, and if body size is a heritable trait, which we know it is, this can lead to changes over time in your population towards smaller and smaller body sizes. And as you might appreciate, we might not want this in terms of desirable outcomes for a fish population. And so this fishing pressure, where maybe larger size fish now experience higher mortality, is sometimes like in the opposite direction of the natural mortality. And oftentimes this fishing pressure can be quite intense and can sort of override any natural selection favoring smaller body size. So there are some prerequisites for these evolutionary changes, and I've just listed a few of them here. So as I mentioned, you do need heritable variation in your quantitative traits. These traits need to have some heritable components, so meaning they're passed on from parents to their offspring. You also need selective pressure to be strong enough, so you need to be harvesting enough for this to exert selection on your population, and you need enough time for these evolutionary changes to occur. So this concept of fisheries-induced evolution is really intuitive, and so intuitive, in fact, that it's been around for quite some time. So the earliest study that I can find reference to this concept of harvest or fisheries-induced evolution date back to this study done on the West Coast. I'm getting all kinds of notifications. Anyway, on the West Coast, looking at Chinook salmon populations. And there, a biologist studying this population made this note here that a stock raiser would never think of selling his farm pack, keeping only the runts to breed from. And what he was referring to here was that practice of fishers of sort of always taking the largest, most healthiest fish out of your population, leaving behind the smaller, sort of less healthy fish that then sort of form the basis of your population in years to come. So rather an intuitive idea that makes sense, especially when we think about examples from domestic breeding situations. Okay, so despite this idea being around for quite some time, it's really not until the 2000s that people really started to look at this in different fish stocks. So there was some really seminal work done in the 70s and 80s looking at this, but it was in the 2000s when people really started developing tools and analyzing trends in various fish stocks all over the place. So one of the studies that really got things going was this study looking at northern cod off the east coast of Newfoundland. And there, what the authors of this study found was that just prior to the collapse of northern cod, there was quite rapid shifts in the maturity schedule. So that's what's shown here. Over the course of several decades, we see that fish shifted their maturity schedule and started reproducing at much smaller sizes and younger ages compared to earlier, sort of at the beginning of the time series when fishing began. And so the authors here concluded that this could be signs or evidence for evolutionary changes in this fish stock. So fish that are maturing earlier in life at smaller sizes, basically have the chance to reproduce before this fishing pressure sort of removes them from the population. Since that study, there's been a number of other studies looking at these changes in a variety of fish stocks, most of them being marine fish stocks. And what these studies have found is that these evolutionary responses, they only, even though some of these fish have longer generation times, they can occur on the order of decades. So certainly, many of our fishing, commercial fisheries, and so on and so forth have been in operation for longer time than that. In addition, what this sort of shows here is that most of the studies have focused on life history traits. And in particular, traits relating to maturation, as I've just shown, but also growth and reproductive investment. However, in recent years, there's been a real explosion of studies looking at the potential for other traits and behaviors to evolve in response to fishing pressure. So I've just listed a few of them here. There's lots of cool examples out there. Something maybe just worth mentioning people might find interesting is the work looking at how the personality traits of fish might be changed through fishing practices. So you might imagine that, maybe the more aggressive, bold fish might be the ones that are more likely to be captured by, a fishery, for example, anglers. And over time, you can see actual, changes in the personality where you might see more shy fish, and these have been linked back to an actual evolutionary changes in these populations. So lots of cool stuff going on this topic. So most of the studies looking at fisheries-induced evolution have involved looking at time series of phenotypic data collected from fish stocks, mostly coming out of commercial fisheries or index netting monitoring programs that are done. And the authors have used various tools to try to remove the effects of the environment and really hone in on underlying evolutionary changes. But that's really difficult to do, and you can never account for all of the evolutionary or sort of all of the environmental changes that could be impacting the trait changes that you're seeing. Another group of studies has looked and demonstrated fisheries-induced evolution in the laboratory, where you can selectively target certain fish and then see what happens in your population and demonstrate whether there's evolution or not. But of course, these lack some of the realism that we might see out in the natural environment. Now, given the development of new genetic tools, there's sort of an exciting new area of research where people are starting to look for genetic sort of signs of evolutionary change caused by fishing through genetic analysis. And this is really exciting, and I look forward to some of the papers that are no doubt going to come out sort of looking for the genetic evidence for these evolutionary changes and what's involved there. Right, so what about fish stocks in the Great Lakes? So as I've indicated, most of the examples and most of the studies on fisheries-induced evolution have focused on marine fish stocks. And I would say that when I've gone around and spoken to various people about fisheries-induced evolution, there is a general feeling out there that this is something that might be more important or prevalent in marine fish stocks, where you have, these really large industrial fleets, involving multiple nations. You might have, trawling fisheries out there, scooping up all your fish, really really selective, and really high harvest pressure. And one of the key messages of my presentation is just that, you know, there's no reason to believe that these things couldn't also be happening in the Great Lakes. You know, we have substantial commercial fisheries operating, and we also have a lot of recreational harvest operating. And in some cases, these harvest rates, you know, can be fairly high, certainly high enough to induce evolutionary change. And, you know, we have different species with different life history characteristics, some with faster generation times, some with longer generation times. Certainly the potential is there for these types of changes. Now, despite that potential, there really hasn't been a whole lot of research looking at all different fish stocks within the Great Lakes. And I wrote a review paper a couple of years ago now, just looking at the potential for these changes sort of across different populations in the Great Lakes, and looking at the potential given the timelines for fisheries, the harvest pressures involved, and just some of the features of the fisheries in terms of their selectivity, to look for, you know, just the potential for these evolutionary changes to occur. So for today's talk, I'm going to focus on a particular example that I've been involved with, and that is looking for signs or evidence or predictions of fisheries-induced evolution in lake whitefish within the Great Lakes. So lake whitefish are a commercially harvested species throughout the lakes. And this graph shows commercial harvest over time in lake whitefish populations from different lakes. The largest fisheries currently operate in Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, so that's the blue and red. And the main take-home message here of this graph is just that these populations have been experiencing commercial harvest for, you know, more than a century. So given what we know of marine systems and our examples there, this is certainly enough time for at least there to be the potential for these changes. The other key message I want to convey is in terms of harvest mortality rates. So this graph on the right shows fishing mortality rates through time for different age classes of lake whitefish, and this is from Lake Huron. And the message here I want to convey is that these harvest mortality rates can in some cases be quite high, and certainly high enough based again on what we know in other systems to induce these types of evolutionary responses. So the potential is there. Now, there's other sort of nuances that may affect the likelihood of these evolutionary changes, and this just relates to, you know, the generation time and life history characteristics of the species that you're looking at. So for my work, I was interested in looking at the potential for fisheries-induced evolution in whitefish, given this timeline and history of commercial harvest. And to do that, I built what's called an ecogenetic or an eco-evolutionary model. And this is a modeling tool that really tries to incorporate these feedbacks between ecological and evolutionary dynamics. So typically most fishery population models, you know, operate in the ecological realm. So, you know, they don't include any evolution. On the other side of things, we have, you know, really highly theoretical evolutionary models that don't always have those key ecological feedbacks that can really affect the rates of change in your population, which is, you know, going to matter from a management perspective. So I built one of these ecogenetic models for lake whitefish in the Great Lakes, and this model is an individual-based model. So it's tracking the fate of individuals over time, and it basically follows through the life cycle of a fish. So the fish is born, it grows, it matures, it reproduces, it you know, creates new fish, and so on and so forth. Now there's natural mortality. Oh my God. Sorry, I'm just getting these really annoying notifications to sign in on my M&R account. Okay, so oh, they just keep popping up on my screen. Sorry about that. So we have natural mortality acting in the model. I just have to keep telling it to stop doing that. And then on top of that, we also have harvest mortality. In these models, the genetic traits are life history traits that we follow through time, and you can have different genetic traits. And these genetic traits are passed on from parents down to their offspring with some heritability. So what we do in these models is we manipulate harvest mortality, and then we look at how that affects evolutionary responses in these life history traits. But we can also look at other things like, how the growth rates or other traits change. We can look at how fishing affects population abundance and yield. And then we can also manipulate different levels of harvest, look at different, types of year, different selectivity, that sort of thing. Another key feature of these models is that evolution can be switched on or off, which is really nice because it allows you to really hone in on any sort of changes that arise just due to evolution alone. So you can really start to explore, how does evolution, and in turn ignoring evolution, matter? My computer seems to have frozen. Can you see it? Okay, so as I mentioned, there's genetic traits in the model that can evolve over time. And one of the key traits in this whitefish model that I'm speaking about is called a probabilistic maturation reaction norm. And this probabilistic maturation reaction norm is basically a fancy way for describing the sizes and ages at which there's some probability to mature in your population. So in this example, what we're looking at is just a linear reaction norm. And then the midpoint of that reaction norm is the sizes and ages at a particular, the sizes and ages at which there is a probability of maturing of 50%. You can also look at other contours along this. So there's variation around that. So you can look at the 25% probability and the 75% probability, for example. And this approach recognizes that there's variation inherent in your population. So not all fish mature at exactly the same length, right? There's variation around that. So when individuals in your population grow and how quickly they grow determines when they intercept this reaction norm, and that ultimately affects the ages and sizes of maturity in your population. So this reaction norm can actually evolve over time. So it can move up or down, and then the slope can vary as well. And the amount of evolutionary change is a function of the coefficient of genetic variation, which just describes the scope for evolution. So just think of it like this. If you have a lot of genetic variation, you have a lot more scope or room for evolutionary change. And if you have very narrow or low variation, you have a very low scope for evolutionary change. Okay, so when we start fishing in our population, our growth rates might increase. And this is just caused by the reduction in population biomass or abundance that occurs, and so growth goes up. Now, when this happens, we see a shift along our reaction norm, and fish are now reproducing at different sizes and ages than originally, but this is not due to any underlying evolutionary change. On the flip side, we may have evolution of that reaction norm, and in this case, growth rates have still changed, but now that reaction norm has evolved, and so we're looking at a different size and age maturity in your population, some of that being due to this ecological response and growth, and some due to an evolutionary change. So basically, I looked at how fishing pressure for lake whitefish could influence the evolution of this trait. And this is basically what I found. So this is showing that sort of probabilistic maturation reaction norm, now shown in colors, basically, before harvest. So I've just overlaid that reaction norm, but basically here where we have the white area, that's where there's 0 or very low probability of maturing. And up here, the red color indicates where there's a very high probability of maturing. So what we look at is what happens to this when we start harvesting. Well, after 100 years of harvest and over the time course, we see this downward shift of this reaction norm, basically. So before harvesting, this is what the growth rates looked like on this side, and you can see the sizes and ages at which fish were. This is the mean size and age at maturation in your population. Then, due to this evolutionary change, and also there's some shift in the growth rate, fish are now maturing at much, much smaller sizes, and not only that, but way younger ages than previously. This is just showing things in a slightly different way. So if we were to track sort of the midpoint of that reaction norm over time, this is what it would look like. So when we introduce fishing into our population, we see this downward shift in this length at 50% maturation probability. But then when we stop fishing, we actually don't see that this trait just bounces back up to where it was. It has a very, very slow return trajectory. So this just speaks to the importance of recognizing these types of changes, because they can have such a huge effect on the recovery of traits and just sort of the rapidness at which these populations sort of rebound from any changes. Okay, so I had a PhD student, Jenny Lee Gobin, who sort of took this basic lake whitefish model and sort of added some further features to it, basically, that made it a little more realistic. And what she specifically looked at was the recent ecosystem changes that have occurred in Lake Huron and how those ecological conditions may alter these predictions for fisheries-induced evolution that I've just shown you. So Jenny Lee's work focused on Lake Huron, mainly in the southern main basin of Lake Huron, where we have the largest fishery within Lake Huron for lake whitefish. And in Lake Huron, there's been substantial changes stemming from the invasion and establishment of dry-cynid mussels. And one of the major shifts that have occurred in Lake Huron is basically the near disappearance of Diaperia, which was an important prey species for lake whitefish. And what Jenny Lee's research has found was that stemming from these changes, the recruitment potential of lake whitefish has changed. So now the number of new recruits to the population produced per spawning female has declined. So that recruitment potential has gone down. As well, the growth potential has also declined, and this is owing back to the loss of that important prey. So these are really important processes, and Jenny Lee looked at how these changes may affect the rate at which these whitefish populations can adapt to harvest. So she built an ecogenetic model and basically contrasted this sort of pre-dry-cynid condition to a post-dry-cynid condition, altering this growth potential and the recruitment potential. So lower growth potential, lower recruitment potential. Now, another aspect that Jenny Lee added into her model to make it a little more realistic was the specific selectivity regime from the fishing gear that is used to fish for lake whitefish. And so these include gill nets and trap nets. This is showing the selectivity of these gill nets and trap nets. So this just means the sizes of fish that are vulnerable to these different types of fishing gear. And gill nets have a dome-shaped selectivity curve, where both smaller fish and larger fish aren't captured as readily by the fishing gear. Larger fish actually just basically bounce off of the net because they can't get entangled in it. And this selectivity curve is quite a bit different than what we see with the trap net fishery, where we have a typical S-shaped selectivity curve. So Jenny Lee was interested in including these two types of fishing gear because the implications for evolution could be very different because of the different sizes of fish that could be captured. Okay, so what did Jenny Lee find? So again, she's looking at predictions for fisheries-induced evolution before and after dry-cynid mussels have invaded. So this graph is showing the percentage change in that genetic trait. So basically the amount of evolution in maturation size for both a trap net fishery and the gill net fishery. And along this axis, along the bottom, she has increased the maximum harvest pressure of that population and looked at how that's influenced the amount of evolution of our trait. And so we're also looking at the difference between the trap net and the gill net fishery. And then she also looked at what happens when you change the mesh size for your fishery. So we have a small mesh net, medium, and large mesh. And then again, we're contrasting the situation before dry synods, that's the solid line, with the situation after dry synods, that's the little X's there. And so what she found was basically as you increase the harvest pressure, we see more evolution, so more of this downward shift when there's no dry synods present. And importantly, she found that for this trap net fishery, when dry synods are in the system, there's actually not as much evolution predicted. The predictions were a little bit different for the gill net fishery, where there's sort of this crossover where, you know, before dry synods, there's actually less evolution, but then that sort of flips as we increase the harvest pressure further. And then we get the same situation arriving where basically there's less evolution when you have dry synods present. The other thing she found was that as you increase the mesh size, the overall amount of evolutionary change is reduced quite a bit. And this is just because of where fish are maturing relative to when they're vulnerable to harvest. So you imagine that if you have, say, a very large mesh or a very high minimum size limit that is occurring well after most fish in your population have matured, well, there's no selection sort of favoring early maturity. There's no need to evolve. You know, other traits may be subject to evolution, but you know, age or size of maturity is not going to be under selective control. Versus if you're harvesting fish just at or prior to when they mature, there's a really big payoff in terms of fish that are able to mature earlier, you know, reproduce, pass on their genes before being harvested. So a really important aspect or the implications of Jenny Lee's work is that this situation where we have less evolution with dry synods actually leads to reduced stock productivity and means that you can sustainably remove actually less fish from the population through fishing. So there's real implications here for sustainable harvest levels of lake whitefish. So the other aspect of management and in terms of understanding some of the management dynamics is understanding how these types of evolutionary changes that I've been talking about might go on to influence the predictions of stock assessment models. This is work that I've done in collaboration with Yingming Zhao at the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, where we basically ask the question, do these evolutionary changes affect our stock assessment models that we commonly use for management? So stock assessment models are used worldwide, including in the Great Lakes, and they're used to provide management advice on sustainable harvest levels for exploited stocks. Now, stock assessment models can be quite complex. However, at their heart, they most often, in almost all cases, involve very basic assumptions about population dynamics. And as you might appreciate, those dynamics don't include evolution, right? And so they use this underlying population dynamics model to predict population sizes and sustainable harvest rates based on information that you're getting out of the fishery or from your monitoring program. And so that underlying population dynamics model is pretty important to determine the accuracy of these stock assessment models. So we wanted to look into this further. How does evolution basically affect the predictions of our stock assessment model? So to do this, Ying and I took one of these ecogenetic models for harvesting, and then we actually ran a stock assessment model on the catch, just as you would for a stock out in the lake. We then run that stock assessment model and then make a prediction for stock size. We can then compare that predicted stock size with the known stock size. And in order to understand how does evolution, or more importantly, ignoring evolution, alter the predictions of your stock assessment model. So to do that, Ing and I just first started out by taking the most basic stock assessment model you can imagine, because we kind of wanted to understand this sort of like in simple terms before we moved on to adding more complex features. I'm just going to walk you through the basics of this, this stock assessment model. So in this model, we have the catch from our commercial fishery, and this depends, and this is done for each age class and year. And that catch from the fishery is a function of the abundance of fish in the lake, multiplied by the selectivity. So this is getting back at those selectivity curves, where certain age classes are more selected or more vulnerable to the gear than others. And then it's also multiplied by this catchability coefficient. This catchability is, it can depend on the environment. So maybe it's affected by water clarity. It also might depend on the features of the species or the activity levels of a population. But for the purposes of this presentation, we just kept that catchability coefficient constant. So you can rearrange this equation, and then you can come up with a prediction for stock size based on the observed catch that you have coming out of your fishery. And so, if we ignore evolutionary changes, we're ignoring the effect that they may, and ignoring the effect that they may have on evolution, or sorry, on these parameters, selectivity and catchability. This denominator is going to be constant. However, if evolution is changing that selectivity curve, this may in turn impact the ability of that stock assessment model to predict population abundance. So that's basically what we did. We looked at, is evolution changing selectivity, and how does that influence predictions from our stock assessment model? So this graph shows the results. This is showing the selectivity after 100 years of harvest at a very low harvest rate of 10%. And this is looked at for different age classes. We then have different levels of genetic variation. So this is that coefficient of variation, or that scope for evolution. And we see that each one of these lines is a different variation level. So thicker lines mean more variation, which means more evolution essentially. So what we see here is that at these very young ages, there's not much effect of the evolutionary change on your selectivity. But when we start to get up to these middle or later ages, that's where we start to see the effects of evolution. So we see that our selectivity parameter is actually decreased as a result of these evolutionary changes. We can also look at other harvest rates. So here we're looking at 10%, 30%, 50%, and 70%. And you can see that this effect is sort of amplified as we ramp up that harvest pressure. So again, the more harvest pressure, the more evolution, the more that selectivity parameter is affected by our evolutionary changes. So next, I'm going to show you what happens to our predictions for stock size. So this shows basically the difference between your predicted stock size and the actual stock size when you ignore these changes in selectivity. So this was done again for different levels of variation along the x-axis here, and for different harvest rates. So in this graph, each little bar there, each colored bar, is a different harvest rate and a different coefficient of variation. And so there's a lot going on here, but the key take-home message is that for low to sort of, basically low levels of genetic variation and low to moderate levels of harvest, our stock sizes are actually overestimated. And then interestingly, as we have higher rates of evolution, higher rates of coefficient of variation, and more harvest, we actually see in this case, our stock sizes are underestimated. And the importance here is that when we are overestimating stock sizes, we may be harvesting too much, right? Because we're predicting what the harvest level should be. And when we're underestimating our stock sizes, we may not be taking as much harvest from these populations as we could. So there are implications here for just, how we should go about setting harvest levels for these populations and some of the dangers inherent in ignoring these evolutionary changes. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears here for the last few moments of my talk and talk about another source of selection within the Great Lakes that could be very important from a fisheries management perspective. And the example is basically the potential for sea lamprey to evolve resistance to a chemical pesticide used to control them. So sea lamprey are a parasitic invasive species in the Great Lakes. When they invaded the Great Lakes and spread, they really decimated native fish populations, including some of our important top predators like lake trout. In the 1950s, a chemical pesticide called 3-trifluoromethyl-4-nitrophenol, or TFM for short, which is much easier to say, TFM for short, discovered to selectively kill sea lamprey, and it's applied to tributaries around the Great Lakes. And owing to the chemical control from TFM, we see that the population abundance of sea lamprey has been controlled and was substantially reduced in response to the use of TFM. Now, I've just showed you the example of harvest-induced evolution. Perhaps it's not much of a stretch to think that, well, if this pesticide is, selectively killing sea lamprey, it may be the case that we might expect to see evolution of certain adaptations that allow sea lamprey to adapt to this new selective regime to evolve. And so, this is the concept of pesticide resistance that we've seen in other agricultural systems. So, sorry, before I go on, I just wanted to mention there was a symposium or workshop held by the Great Lakes Fishery Commission where a number of people got together just to sort of discuss the potential for this, because the repercussions would be quite severe if lamprey were to develop resistance. This would mean, more parasites and potentially further damage to our native fish populations, which have been able to recover because of TFM. And following that, we wrote a review paper where we looked into this further. And then there's been a number of sort of blowing up from that. And I'm going to share with you just very quickly a few of some of the projects that I've been involved in, most notably where I built one of these ecogenetic models to look at the potential for selection from TFM to cause changes in life history traits of sea lamprey. So again, just like harvest, now we're talking about selection from TFM. So, in this life cycle of a sea lamprey, adult sea lamprey migrate into tributaries where they spawn. The adults die. Larvae are born in these tributaries. They burrow down into the sediments, and they can spend upwards of 3 to 10 years there before they undergo metamorphosis and then migrate out to the lake environment, which is where they parasitize fish that we care about. And so perhaps it's not much of a stretch to think that if we're applying this pesticide and it's applied to tributaries to target these larval populations, that there might be selection over time in terms of maybe inducing sort of earlier ages at metamorphosis, because of course, if you can undergo undergo metamorphosis and leave the stream before the TFM is applied, well, you're more likely to reproduce and pass on your genes. So basically, I built an ecogenetic model of sea lamprey, including all of the aspects of their life history to look, and it also included tributary dynamics in order to look at the possibility that this selection from TFM could cause changes in the age and size at metamorphosis. And so this is the results of the model. So we have age at metamorphosis, and we have time. And so TFM is applied at a given year and then every year subsequent to that. And then we have different treatment levels that I looked at: a low treatment level, a medium treatment level, and a high treatment level, just corresponding to the number of tributaries that are treated. And then I turned on and off evolution to essentially look at how does allowing for this type of evolutionary response, how does that alter what we would predict? And so the first point here is that for all of these scenarios, there was a reduction in the age at metamorphosis. However, this is largely caused by this demographic compensation that occurs, where you've reduced the population size of lamprey, so growth rates of larvae can increase and they can reach metamorphosis earlier in life. However, we can really start to see the effects of evolution come out over time. So that's what these blue triangles show. So if you watch this blue triangle, we're seeing that when we have evolution present, there's further declines in that age at metamorphosis. We can then see the same pattern when we look at other treatment levels. And finally, for the highest treatment level, when we don't allow that lamprey population to adapt, it actually goes extinct. So basically, because of these evolutionary changes, we see lower ages at metamorphosis. So what does this matter to our to control for sea lamprey? Well, basically it equates to more parasites. So if more larvae are undergoing metamorphosis early in life, we have more parasites in the population, and we can really start to see the costs of these evolutionary changes in terms of reducing the effectiveness of our control. So there's real implications here for fisheries management. All right, I'm going to skip over the last part there. So just to wrap things up very quickly, I hope that what you've gained from this presentation is that these feedbacks between ecological and evolutionary dynamics are important to consider, including from a management perspective. In the Great Lakes, we have many different sources of selection. I've just talked about a few of them, but there's certainly many more out there. And I think this really needs further investigation, given the implications involved. And so just a final thought to leave you with is just this paper that was written where some of these concepts are explained quite nicely. And that is that, we really do need to apply evolutionary biology thinking when we're thinking about addressing some of the major global challenges that we have. So the reason for this is basically the speed and ability of populations to adapt is really important to facing some of these challenges, because we see that on the one hand, populations that adapt too slowly, for example, in response to climate change, we may say these populations could potentially go extinct. On the other hand, if populations adapt too quickly, this also causes problems. So this is that example of pesticide resistance, or the example where harvest-induced evolution leads to, declines in body size of fish or yield and these sorts of things. So having this evolutionary perspective is really key when we're thinking about addressing these things. And that is it for my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erin. I'd like to extend my thanks and all of our thanks here at GLIER and TRS, all of the grad students. And also thank you for everyone who attended today. I think we have a few questions from the audience that we'll take. And the first question we have is, how would you assess the shyness or boldness of a fish? And this is from Libby.
Well, I guess, yeah, there's a number of approaches that you could do that. So, I mean, you could look at sort of just basically look at activity rates of your fish and surmise certain characteristics from that, how that might translate into behavioral changes. But I know a lot of this work has involved actually taking fish back to the laboratory and basically trying to describe or quantify the behaviors of fish just through just like kind of behavioral studies basically, but done on fish in the lab, where you're measuring certain, the number of times they might strike a lure, or the number of times they're sort of chase a prey, or those sorts of things. So there's other things you can do, like, they put up a mirror, for example, and they look at how aggressive that fish is in terms of, you know, trying to attack basically the images in the mirror. So, you know, I don't do work in this realm, but there's like a whole field of science looking at how you measure behaviors of fish, but it's pretty cool stuff.
Thank you. And I'll just remind everyone too, before if you have to leave, the next meeting is on December 4th at 10 a.m. All right, so the next question is from Marco regarding the predictions with and without dry synods. What is a reasonable sustainable harvest? Is it at the 30 to 50% level where the model predicts evolutionary changes?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, defining, you know, first of all, there's no one sustainable harvest level, just because I think it's what's really important to appreciate from this is that things are always changing, right? So that harvest level, you know, how much you should be harvesting, let's say, really depends so much on the current environment. So it's not like a static thing that can be measured sort of like one time, and you know, it's sort of that traditional model that we have of maximum sustainable yield, and you measure this maximum sustainable yield for your population, and it sort of holds true for all for many years or all of time. You have like sort of one yield curve for your population. We know now that can change, and so, you know, I would just offer that, but I think that yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but basically it is hard to sort of just measure this like one sustainable harvest rate. But I would say that just based on some of the work that I've done, that I guess what you might want in terms of, you know, if you're interested in, you know, how much fish can we sort of maximally harvest from this lake without causing sort of declines that might turn back and influence key attributes of our population, or influence how much fish we can then that population produces. I guess you want ideally like a little bit of evolution, because if you have a little bit of evolution, the population can adapt, and you actually you know, productivity of the population actually increases. But over time, you start to see the effects of the life history changes start to come out and be more and more important. So you don't want too much evolution that suddenly there's like fish are way smaller, because that's also going to influence how productive the population there is. So there is sort of like this trade-off, and so you want to find where that trade-off exists, basically, but it is challenging.
Cool. Our next question is there evidence to suggest that these changes are not the results of phenotypic plasticity? If not, then what would be an appropriate test to rule out phenotypic plasticity and that it is actually genetic change?
Yeah, so that's, you know, that's a huge challenge with all of this work. And so I kind of mentioned at the beginning of my talk that, you know, most studies have focused on looking at basically you're measuring phenotypes when you go out in these populations and you measure growth or maturity. You know, you're measuring phenotypes, and so you're not measuring, you know, you don't know exactly the genetic trait value, let's say. And so there's a number of statistical tools that people have developed to try to remove the effects of the environment. And that's kind of one of the reasons this idea of reaction norms has sort of really gained popularity, is that you kind of remove, to a certain extent, the variation brought about just through changes in growth. And growth is typically, you know, responds much more plastically to change. So I would say there's like these statistical tools that allow us to get closer at that, but they don't get us all the way. And so many people have used laboratory studies. So you might bring fish back to the lab and that way demonstrate that the changes that you're seeing are in nature. And then I mentioned, you know, sort of now there's starting to be people looking at now more sort of getting right down to the basics and looking for, you know, genetic changes in the underlying genotype of populations, and this involves understanding, you know, what genes code for different life history traits, and that is a really complicated thing to do, because life history traits are so complex and they involve many gene loci in cases. So mapping that out is tricky, but people are working on it.
Thank you. I think we have our last question, similar topic. Given that in most cases fisheries data are not genetic, models predict additive effects of ecology and low density and evolution. Any thoughts on how one can sort these out than data just on morphological changes? And that's from Marco.
I think we may have lost Erin there. So I think that wraps up our seminar. So again, I'd like to share or express our thanks, both graduate students at GLIER and TRUS programs, to Erin. I'm not sure if she can hear us or not, but also to everyone who attended today. We'd also like to share our next speaker, Dr. Supriyo Kumar Das, who is an Antarctic freshwater scientist from Presidency University in India. Oh, there's Erin.
I have no clue what happened there. It's, yeah, anyway.
That's okay.
Hopefully that
think
didn't happen in my talk and I didn't know about it.
No, not at all. That was the first time it happened. I think we're going to end it there, wrap up our seminar. I'm going to repeat from all of us, both at GLIER and TRUS programs, all our graduate students, we'd like to extend our thanks to you. And again, everyone who attended. Thank you, Erin. It was a great talk, directly relatable to my research, and I'm sure a lot of other students here as well. I'm going to also share again our next speaker, who's Dr. Supriyo Kumar Das, who is an Antarctic freshwater scientist from Presidency University in India. So again, thank you. That wraps up our 5th installment of our seminar series. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
That was fun. What a great turnout. I'll just wait for.
Yeah, thank you.
It was so frustrating, like my stupid government computer, like there's this login thing. It doesn't usually happen, like, I don't know, in the morning, but it just like, I kept getting all these notifications coming up saying that I needed to like reconnect and put in my password and everything. And it was just.
Oh my gosh, I have the same thing where you have to have like we have a 2-step verification. Yes, I know.
And so my phone like just started like buzzing and like, I'm just like, why is this happening now?
I'm sorry, but you had a great, I mean, with all the technical difficulties between all of us, that was a great turnout. And yeah, just a really engaging
hopefully it was okay. It's a strange thing giving a presentation through a computer screen. So hopefully it was all right.
I see a couple of our graduate students are just hanging back. So do you want to stick around for any questions? Do you guys have any questions? Please feel free to turn your videos on or unmute yourselves if you wanted to talk to Erin a little bit longer. Yeah, they're all our graduate students there. Okay. Yeah, so.
It was a great talk. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Erin.
All right, take care.
See you later.
Thanks, Erin.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.